Let's kick things off by understanding the rise of the American dollar. The US, over the course of a century, managed to move from being a relatively small player to becoming the world's undisputed financial powerhouse. But what's even more interesting is the role the global economic system plays in shaping the future of the US dollar. If we take a good look at the system, you'll see that this isn't just by chance. It's a carefully crafted strategy that involves political and economic forces working together. Let's break it down from the start. The US, after the First World War, was in a strong position globally. By the time World War II rolled around, the country had the largest share of gold reserves in the world. This placed them in an advantageous spot at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the global financial system was redesigned. Back then, they made a crucial decision. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency, replacing the British pound, and all global trade would be done using the dollar. It was a masterstroke. Why did the US make this move? It was all about control. When the US tied the dollar to gold, it gave their currency a level of stability that no one could challenge. And that worked. The US dollar became the cornerstone of global finance. But over time, as the global economy grew, there were unforeseen consequences. One of the key players in this game was the US government's ability to print money. They could essentially create dollars out of thin air. It was like a magic trick that kept the global economy running smoothly. But this wasn't just a coincidence. The release of dollars with no real backing meant that the US could essentially keep inflating its economy, while other countries remained dependent on the dollar. This created a system that allowed the US to print as much money as it wanted, without worrying too much about inflation or devaluation, at least in the short term. Of course, things got a bit trickier when the US started running into massive debts, especially after the Vietnam War and the oil crisis in the 1970s. The country was losing its competitive edge, and it seemed like the dollar might no longer be as secure as it once was. But then came a solution that would change everything: the petrodollar. Enter Henry Kissinger and the Saudi royal family. In the early 1970s, the US struck an agreement with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection and weapons, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell all of its oil in US dollars. This was the game changer. It meant that any country wanting to buy oil from Saudi Arabia and eventually from other OPEC nations had to use US dollars. And because oil is such a critical resource, this created a guaranteed perpetual demand for the US dollar worldwide. By 1975, the deal had spread to all of OPEC, ensuring that the US dollar remained the world's most sought-after currency. It wasn't just about oil anymore. The US now had control over the global economy in a way that no other nation could compete with. The beauty of this system was that oil-producing countries, flush with cash from selling oil, had to reinvest their profits back into US assets, primarily US government bonds. This effectively created a system where the US could print money without worrying about running out of reserves or facing severe inflation, because the world was constantly recycling those dollars back into the US economy. This is where things get interesting. With the petrodollar system in place, the US had become the financial kingpin of the world, able to control global trade and markets through its currency. But the real power came just from having control over the flow of money, but from having a system where countries around the world were forced to hold dollars as part of their foreign reserves. Now, you might be wondering, what happens when things go wrong? What happens when other countries start looking for alternatives to the US dollar? Well, that's where the real intrigue lies. You see, over the years, some countries have tried to move away from the US dollar in trade and investment. They've sought alternatives, such as the euro or the Chinese yuan. But the petrodollar system has been so entrenched that it's been hard to break free. Even now, as global power shifts, the US still holds a strong grip on the financial world. But here's the catch: the US dollar isn't as untouchable as it once was. Countries like Russia and China have been making moves to reduce their reliance on the dollar. They've been building new systems to trade oil and other commodities outside the control of the US. And this is where things are starting to get interesting. The rise of these alternative systems poses a serious threat to the US's financial dominance. If countries like Russia and China manage to convince others to abandon the US dollar, it could mean the end of the petrodollar era, and the US would no longer have the upper hand in global financial markets. The consequences of this could be huge, not just for the US, but for the global economy as a whole. And this brings us to one of the most interesting parts of the story: the way that the US has used the petrodollar to its advantage. The petrodollar system has allowed the US to maintain an advantage over other nations by ensuring that they remain dependent on US currency for essential resources like oil. But now, with the rise of alternative financial systems, this advantage is starting to slip away. Let's talk about the rise of the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries have been working together to challenge the US-dominated global financial system. They've been setting up new trade deals, including oil trades, in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar altogether. This has the potential to destabilize the US's control over global trade and weaken the dollar's dominance. Russia and China, in particular, have been pushing for a new financial order, one that isn't tied to the US dollar. They've been creating new financial institutions and systems that are designed to challenge the existing global financial architecture, and it's starting to gain traction. The US has already started to feel the pressure. In response to these efforts, the US has resorted to economic and political tactics to try to undermine these countries and prevent them from succeeding. The US has used sanctions, economic pressure, and even military threats to maintain its position. But the rise of alternative financial systems and the gradual decline of the petrodollar could signal a shift in the global balance of power. As more countries move away from the US dollar, the US may lose its ability to control the global economy in the same way it has for the past several decades. And this is where we get to the next crucial part of the story: the future of the US dollar. If the petrodollar system collapses, and if countries continue to look for alternatives to the US dollar, the US could face serious economic challenges. The dollar's value could decline, and the US could lose its status as the world's primary financial power. The collapse of the petrodollar would have major implications for the global economy. It would change the way trade is conducted, and it would shift the balance of power in the world. Countries would no longer be forced to rely on the US dollar to buy oil, and that could lead to the US losing its economic leverage. It's not just the US that will be affected, though. The entire world could see major shifts in its financial systems as countries begin to use alternative currencies for trade. New financial systems could emerge, and we could be looking at a completely different global financial landscape. So, the question now is, what's next for the US and the world? Will the petrodollar continue to dominate, or is the global financial order about to undergo a major transformation? Time will tell. What's quite obvious is that the release of money from thin air, with no backing, and the massive profits the US government gains, is one of the absurd everyday realities. Another important truth here is that the Nelson-Anri Act actually allows them to manipulate the value of the US dollar. They can either increase or decrease its value. Commercial banks, on the other hand, have the liberty to inject or withdraw money from the market at will. It's like a magic trick. The big players are the ones who set the rules, inflating the economic bubble, or popping it whenever they fancy, triggering what we call a controlled recession. But the story doesn't end there. All of this is just the groundwork for a century of chaos engineered by the so-called dark forces in order to complete their scheme and expand their influence. worldwide. These dark forces, which we can loosely refer to as the US political elite, created something called petrodollar, a golden sword that guarantees America's interests globally. Anyone who dares to oppose it will feel the sharp edge of that sword. Let's sit back and sip some tea while we get into the story of the petrodollar. It all starts with a visionary move by America's political and economic elite. The petrodollar system made the US dollar the global currency, one that no country could resist. The US was able to firmly sit on its throne as the world's leading power. Humanity has gone through many eras, like the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and now we're in the era of oil. Unlike gold, oil is essential for production, consumption, and basically every operation today. Without it, we'd be back in the Dark Ages. Oil has propelled humanity into the age of technology, mechanization, and modernization. It's practically a part of every aspect of life now. The global demand for oil is over 100 million barrels a day. A huge amount of oil is pumped from the ground. So, whoever controls oil controls the global economy. The Americans realized this early on, and after the gold standard game ended, they started a new strategy: dollars for oil, the petrodollar. But before we dive into the petrodollar, let's go back to the Bretton Woods Conference. This infamous conference laid the foundation for America to launch its dollar to dominate the global financial system. After World War I, countries tried to return to the gold standard, but it all collapsed during the Great Depression in the 1930s. In response, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944 to rebuild the global financial system to prevent another economic crisis. The aim was to create a unified financial system with rules that all member nations had to follow to avoid the economic chaos that plagued Germany post-WWI. At this meeting, the world agreed to establish the International Monetary Fund (IMF), the World Bank (WB), and most importantly, a fixed exchange rate system built around the US dollar, which was still pegged to gold. The reason they chose the US dollar was because, at the time, the US controlled more than half of the world's production and held nearly all of the world's gold. So, they made the US dollar the global benchmark for the world's currencies, and countries had to adjust their exchange rates around it. Here's how it worked. Let's say someone in Germany wanted to trade their Deutschmarks for gold. They'd exchange their marks for US dollars and then take the dollars to the US to convert them into gold. The Bretton Woods system meant that central banks of all countries, except the US, had to maintain a fixed exchange rate between their currencies and the US dollar. This required intervention in the foreign exchange markets. If a country's currency was too strong against the US dollar, their central bank would sell their own currency to buy US dollars and lower the value of their own currency. If their currency was too weak, they'd buy their own currency, increasing its value. The Bretton Woods system lasted until 1971, when the US faced high inflation and trade deficits, which reduced the dollar's value. America tried to convince West Germany and Japan to increase the value of their currencies, but they were reluctant as doing so would hurt their exports. In the end, the US abandoned the fixed exchange rate system and allowed the dollar to float. The dollar dropped in value, and the world leaders tried to restore the Bretton Woods system with the Smithson Agreement of 1971, but it failed. By 1973, the US and other countries agreed to let their currencies float freely against each other. The US withdrew from the Bretton Woods system, leaving it worthless. So, how could the US still maintain the power of its dollar without the gold standard? The answer came in the form of soft power. Rather than forcing countries to follow American rules, they would need to use something no country could live without: oil. Enter the petrodollar. The deal was simple. All oil transactions had to be done in US dollars. The US struck an agreement with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, that they would only sell their oil in US dollars, and in return, the US would provide military protection and weapons to Saudi Arabia. This agreement spread to the entire Arab world, and by 1975, all OPEC countries had agreed to sell their oil only in US dollars. With this, the US maintained the global demand for its currency. The brilliance of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon lay in this strategy, which kept the world dependent on the dollar, especially as global oil demand skyrocketed. But the true benefit of the petrodollar came when oil producing countries had excess profits. They had to invest that money back into the US economy, primarily in American debt securities. Petrodollar had three major benefits for the US. First, it ensured global demand for the US dollar. As the world needed oil, they needed dollars to buy it, and this created a continuous cycle of dollar demand. Secondly, it increased the demand for US government debt securities, known as the recycling of petrodollars, a strategy designed by Kissinger. Third, the US could use its currency, the one it printed, to buy oil. The US, unlike any other nation, paid for its oil imports with dollars printed at a fraction of the cost, while oil-producing countries had to hold their dollars in US debt. This created a unique advantage. The US could buy oil with the money it printed, and the oil-producing nations had to keep their profits in US securities. And with the SWIFT system established in 1973, the US solidified its control over global financial transactions, using it as a weapon to punish countries like Iran and Russia. By cutting them off from this global network, the petrodollar system helped the US maintain its global dominance. But it's clear that this system is no longer sustainable. Russia and China are building an alternative financial system that could challenge the US dollar's supremacy as countries seek to buy and sell oil in currencies other than the dollar. The petrodollar's days could be numbered. The collapse of the petrodollar seems inevitable, as every country desires to trade in the currency they prefer and with whoever benefits them. This shift is already happening, and as countries like Russia and China move away from the dollar, the US will lose its power to print endless money. This could change the game for America, much like we saw in Libya, Ukraine, and Syria. The decline of the petrodollar could be the first step in a new global financial order.